Something is cracking inside the coalition that put Donald Trump back in the White House, and it's happening in a place nobody expected, the flat, frost-hardened fields of Wisconsin. Here's what they're not telling you on cable news. The farmers who voted for Trump, men and women who work 14-hour days, who live and die by commodity prices and export contracts, are now watching their livelihoods get squeezed from both ends. Tariffs on Mexican imports didn't just raise prices at Walmart, they triggered retaliatory pressure on American agricultural exports flowing south across that border. And Wisconsin, one of the most critical dairy and grain states in this entire country, is sitting directly in the crossfire. This is not a political story. This is an economic anatomy lesson. When you disrupt a supply chain that has been built over 30 years of integrated North American trade, you don't just inconvenience corporations, you bankrupt family farms, you hollow out rural communities, you fracture the very base of working class support that a political movement depends on to survive. And that fracture, it's already showing up in the numbers. Let's start with something most political commentators refuse to say out loud. The American farmer has always been the most politically loyal, the most ideologically consistent, and frankly, the most taken for granted voter in this entire country. Generation after generation, rural America has handed its trust to politicians who wave flags, talk tough, and promise protection. And generation after generation, rural America has been handed the bill when those promises collide with the brutal mathematics of global trade. What's happening right now in Wisconsin is not new in its essence. It is new in its scale, its speed, and its very specific, very dangerous political consequences for Donald Trump and the movement he built. Now, let me give you the real picture of what Wisconsin actually represents economically, because without that, nothing else makes sense. Wisconsin is not just a swing state on a political map. Wisconsin is one of the most agriculturally productive states in the entire United States. It produces more cheese than any other state in the country. It is home to tens of thousands of dairy operations, ranging from small family farms that have been passed down for 4 and 5 generations to mid-sized commercial operations that employ dozens of workers and feed supply chains stretching from Chicago to Los Angeles. Wisconsin also produces significant quantities of corn, soybeans, cranberries, and ginseng. Its agricultural economy is deeply, structurally, and almost irreversibly tied to export markets. And at the very center of those export relationships sits Mexico. Mexico is not just a neighbor. Mexico is the single largest export destination for American agricultural products. Year after year, American farmers ship billions of dollars worth of corn, dairy, pork, beef, and soybeans directly into the Mexican market. And that relationship didn't happen by accident. It was built deliberately, brick by brick, over 30 years, through the architecture of NAFTA and then its successor, the USMCA, a deal, let's not forget, that Trump himself renegotiated and celebrated as one of his greatest achievements during his first term. He called it the greatest trade deal ever made, his own words. Now, in his second term, he is effectively lighting that deal on fire, and the smoke is blowing directly into the faces of Wisconsin dairy farmers who believed in him. Here is where the economic mechanics get really important, and I want you to follow this carefully because this is the part that most news coverage skips entirely. When the Trump administration began imposing broad tariffs on Mexican imports, framing it as a border security measure, a fentanyl crackdown, a reassertion of American sovereignty, Mexico did not simply absorb the blow. Mexico responded. Mexico is not the same country it was in 1994 when NAFTA was first signed. Mexico today is a sophisticated trading nation with diversified relationships. It has trade agreements with the European Union. It has growing ties with Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and Asian markets. Mexico has options. And when the United States imposed tariffs that threatened the Mexican economy, Mexico's government and Mexico's private sector began, quietly but systematically, doing what any rational economic actor does under pressure. They started looking for alternative suppliers. And when Mexico looks for alternative suppliers for the agricultural goods it was buying from American farmers, the first phone call doesn't go to Iowa or Wisconsin. The first phone call goes to Brazil. It goes to Argentina. It goes to the European Union's heavily subsidized dairy sector. It goes to Canada. These are countries and regions that have been waiting patiently and strategically for exactly this kind of opening. A disruption in the American-Mexican agricultural relationship is a gift to every competing agricultural exporter in the world. And once those supply relationships are established, once a Mexican food processor starts buying Brazilian soybeans or European dairy, those contracts don't automatically reverse when American tariffs get lifted. Trade relationships have inertia, they have infrastructure, they have personal relationships and banking arrangements and logistical networks. Losing a market is fast. Getting it back is agonizingly slow and expensive. Wisconsin dairy farmers understand this intuitively, even if they can't always articulate it in the language of trade economics. They understand it the way a carpenter understands wood grain, through feel, through experience, through watching what happens when you cut against the structure of things. And what many of them are feeling right now in conversations happening at feed stores and farm equipment dealerships and church parking lots across the state is something that doesn't have a clean political name, but feels a lot like betrayal. Not the sharp betrayal of an obvious lie, but the slow, grinding betrayal of a policy that was sold as protection and is functioning as punishment. Now, let's talk about the political dimension of this, because this is where things get genuinely consequential for the future of American politics. Wisconsin is one of the most electorally significant states in the country. It sits at the very heart of what analysts call the blue wall, those Midwestern states that Democrats assumed were safe for decades and then lost in 2016. Trump's victory in Wisconsin in 2016 was narrow but real. He won it again in 2020 after a recount. He carried it again in 2024. Wisconsin has been essential to Trump's political coalition. And within Wisconsin, rural counties, the counties full of the dairy farmers and grain producers we've been talking about, have provided enormous vote margins that offset Democratic strength in Milwaukee and Madison. Without those rural margins, Trump's Wisconsin victories simply don't happen mathematically. So when those farmers start to feel economic pain that they can directly, concretely trace back to Trump administration trade policy, the political math begins to shift. And here is the really important thing about that shift. It doesn't require farmers to suddenly become Democrats. It doesn't require them to put on progressive t-shirts and go to rallies for the opposition. All it requires is for enough of them to stay home, to not vote, to feel that familiar working class disillusionment that says, I tried this, it hurt me, and I'm not interested in being used again. That kind of quiet withdrawal from the political process has toppled governments. It has ended political careers, and it is far harder to detect in advance than a dramatic ideological conversion, which means it is also harder for campaigns to address before it becomes an electoral reality. Let me go deeper into the Mexico piece of this, because the relationship between the United States and Mexico right now is more complicated and more consequential than most American media coverage suggests. The Trump administration's approach to Mexico has been built on leverage, specifically the leverage of the American consumer market and the threat of tariffs as a tool to force Mexican compliance on immigration enforcement and drug interdiction. And there is a certain cold logic to that strategy when you examine it purely as a bilateral power negotiation. The United States economy is roughly 15 times larger than Mexico's. The United States is Mexico's largest trading partner by a factor that dwarfs any other relationship. In a pure power analysis, the United States holds more cards. But here is what that analysis misses. It misses the domestic political constraints on Mexican leadership. It misses the nationalism that tariff pressure and explicit threats ignite inside Mexican public opinion. When an American president publicly frames Mexico as a problem to be solved, as a source of criminals and drugs that must be contained, the Mexican government cannot respond with quiet accommodation without paying a severe political price at home. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office in late 2024 as Mexico's first female president, is navigating an extraordinarily difficult position. She needs to maintain a working relationship with Washington because Mexico's economic health depends on it. But she also leads a country with deep, historically rooted sensitivity to American pressure and American condescension. Every time Trump tweets a threat or announces a new tariff package directed at Mexico, Sheinbaum's domestic political space for cooperation narrows. And when her space for cooperation narrows, Mexico's retaliatory economic measures become not just economically rational, but politically necessary for her own survival as a leader. And those retaliatory measures fall on American farmers, the people who did not set the policy, the people who have no lobbyists in Washington powerful enough to stop it, the people who are simply trying to sell cheese and corn and pork to a market they spent decades building, and who are now watching that market flinch away from them because of decisions made in a White House that they helped put there. This dynamic, where the pain of a policy decision falls most heavily on the people least responsible for making it and least powerful to change it, is one of the central patterns of how capitalism and political power actually work in the United States. And I want to spend some time on this because it matters not just for Wisconsin or for Trump specifically, but for our understanding of what is happening to the American working class and rural communities broadly. The political economy of tariffs is always presented to the public in the language of national strength. Tariffs sound tough. They sound like someone finally standing up for American workers. They have emotional resonance because they speak to real grievances, factory closings, lost manufacturing jobs, the genuine devastation that decades of unchecked free trade ideology imposed on communities that had no voice in those decisions. Those grievances are real. I want to be clear about that. The anger that drove people toward economic nationalism in 2016 and again in 2024 was not manufactured. It was not ignorance. It came from lived experience of watching good jobs disappear, of watching communities hollow out, of watching the professional and political class tell you that free trade was wonderful while your town's largest employer moved to Mexico or China. That was a real betrayal by a certain kind of establishment economics, and people had every right to be furious about it. But here is the trap. The trap is that the solution being offered, aggressive tariffs, trade wars, bilateral confrontation, does not actually address the structural problem, and in many cases makes it worse. Because the structural problem is not that trade agreements exist. The structural problem is that trade agreements were designed to maximize corporate profit while leaving working people on both sides of every border without protection, without power, without any share of the gains. The problem was never that Americans were trading with Mexicans. The problem was that the terms of that trade were set by corporations and their lobbyists, not by workers and their representatives. Replacing one bad arrangement with chaotic tariff warfare doesn't fix that fundamental imbalance. It just changes who gets hurt and how. And right now in Wisconsin, who is getting hurt is the dairy farmer, the soybean grower, the pork producer, the person who drove their pickup truck to the polling place and voted for someone they believed was finally, genuinely on their side. Let's talk about the longer-term geopolitical picture, because what is happening in the American-Mexican trade relationship is not occurring in isolation. It is part of a much broader global reorganization of economic relationships that is accelerating right now and that will have consequences lasting for decades. We are living through a period in which the post-World War II architecture of international trade, built around American economic dominance, dollar hegemony, and a liberal trading order centered on institutions like the World Trade Organization, is under severe stress. China's rise has disrupted that order fundamentally. Russia's war in Ukraine has disrupted it further. And now the United States itself, under Trump's second administration, is actively pulling away from the rules-based trading system that it built and has benefited from enormously. This creates a vacuum, and vacuums in international relations are always filled, just not always by the people you'd choose. China has been filling that vacuum with extraordinary strategic patience. The Belt and Road Initiative has given China economic leverage across Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Latin America. China is now Mexico's second largest trading partner. Chinese companies are building manufacturing infrastructure in Mexico specifically to serve the American consumer market through the back door of USMCA, a phenomenon that Trump has identified as a genuine problem, though his proposed solutions have been characteristically blunt and poorly targeted. The deeper point is that the global economic landscape is shifting in ways that make simple bilateral tariff confrontations an increasingly inadequate tool for achieving American strategic objectives. You cannot tariff your way to geopolitical dominance when your competitors are building infrastructure, signing agreements, and cultivating relationships across the entire developing world. And in that larger context, destabilizing your relationship with Mexico, your closest geographic neighbor, your largest agricultural export market, a country that shares a 2,000-mile border with you and whose economic stability is directly tied to the stability of your own southern border, is not strength. It is a strategic error of considerable magnitude. A stable, growing Mexican economy produces Mexican workers who have reasons to stay in Mexico. An economically pressured Mexico, squeezed between American tariffs and the need to find alternative markets and relationships, produces instability, migration pressure, and a political environment increasingly hostile to American interests. The farmers of Wisconsin did not create these geopolitical dynamics, but they are living inside them, and the consequences are arriving at their doors in the form of falling commodity prices, lost export contracts, and the slow, sickening realization that the trade war is not a temporary negotiating tactic. It is a fundamental restructuring of the economic environment they depend on to survive. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough analytical attention, and that is the question of political consciousness among rural Americans. There is a condescending narrative in certain progressive circles that frames rural Trump voters as simply misled, as people who vote against their economic interests because they've been manipulated by culture war messaging. I reject that narrative completely, not because it has no factual basis, but because it misses the more important truth. Rural Americans are not stupid. They are not unaware of their economic interests. They are making rational calculations within a political system that has consistently offered them bad choices. When the Democratic Party abandoned its working class economic base beginning in the 1970s and 1980s and increasingly represented the interests of educated professionals and urban knowledge workers, rural Americans didn't follow the party into its new ideological home. They stayed where they were, and the party moved away from them. Trump, whatever his many profound contradictions, spoke a language of economic grievance that Democrats had stopped speaking. He named enemies, China, Mexico, the global elite, that felt real to people who had experienced the concrete economic damage of the previous 30 years. The question now, the genuinely consequential political question, is what happens when the candidate who spoke that language implements policies that deepen the pain rather than relieving it? What happens to political consciousness when the betrayal becomes undeniable? History offers some uncomfortable answers. Sometimes people double down on their original political commitment because admitting it was wrong feels like too great a psychological cost. Sometimes they withdraw from politics entirely in a kind of exhausted cynicism. And sometimes, not always, not automatically, but sometimes, a genuine political reorientation begins, a questioning of the entire framework, a willingness to consider that the problem might be deeper than bad trade deals, that the problem might be rooted in who actually controls economic and political power in this country and whose interests those institutions are actually designed to serve. That kind of deeper political consciousness is what you see in genuine historical turning points. It is what you saw in the labor movement of the 1930s, when working people who had suffered through the Depression began to understand their situation not just as individual bad luck, but as a structural condition requiring collective response. It is what you saw in various agrarian movements of the late 19th century, when farmers began to understand that their individual economic struggles were connected to the power of railroads, banks, and commodity traders over their lives. Whether something analogous will emerge from the current moment is genuinely uncertain. These things are never inevitable. They require leadership, organization, and a political vehicle capable of channeling anger towards structural change rather than simply toward the next electoral personality. But the conditions for that kind of rethinking are being created right now in places like Wisconsin, and that is worth paying very serious attention to. Let me come back in these final thoughts of the body to the specific concrete situation facing Wisconsin farmers today, because I want you to leave this with something real and grounded, not just analysis floating at altitude. Dairy farming in Wisconsin has already been under severe stress for years before Trump's second-term tariffs added to the pressure. The consolidation of the American agricultural sector over the past 4 decades has squeezed small and mid-sized farms relentlessly. Large corporate agricultural operations have driven down commodity prices through scale and efficiency, making it harder and harder for family farms to compete. Input costs, feed, fuel, equipment, veterinary care have risen steadily, while milk prices have remained volatile and often punishingly low. Many Wisconsin dairy farmers are already operating on margins so thin that a single bad year, a drought, a disease outbreak, a sudden market disruption can end a multi-generational farming operation permanently. Into this already fragile situation, add the disruption of the Mexican export market, and you have something genuinely explosive in its potential consequences. Dairy products that would have gone to Mexico now flood the domestic market, pushing prices down further. The export premiums that helped keep some operations marginally viable disappear. And the political message that was supposed to accompany this pain, the message that says this is temporary, that negotiations are producing results, that relief is coming, that message is increasingly difficult to maintain credibility with people who are watching their bank balances in real time. There are farmers in Wisconsin right now who voted for Trump twice, who put Trump signs in their fields, who argued with their neighbors and relatives about why this was the right choice, and who are now sitting at kitchen tables doing the arithmetic on their operating loans and wondering whether they are going to make it through the year. Those are the real human stakes of the geopolitical story we have been discussing, not abstractions, not polling numbers, real people, real families, real communities that have already absorbed enormous economic punishment over decades, now absorbing more. The political consequence of that human reality cannot be contained by media or messaging. Reality asserts itself. Economic pain cuts through narrative, and the gap between promises and delivery is growing in Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and across Trump's rural base. What happens when that gap becomes politically decisive? What alternatives emerge? What coalitions form? How the American landscape changes is the critical question. Structural economic crises do not resolve neatly. History shows uncertainty, experimentation, suffering, and sometimes transformative change. We do not yet know whether the current pain will catalyze genuine change or deepen cynicism and volatility. What is clear is that Trump's coalition contains real fault lines, economic, geopolitical, and human, and that Mexico, quietly and structurally, is changing the game, not through confrontation, but through the inevitable logic of markets, relationships, and global economic reorientation. The farmers of Wisconsin are caught in this shift, and their next moves, politically, economically, culturally, will profoundly shape the country's future far beyond the next election.